Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and I literally cannot believe we're already on episode 4. I think today's episode is really going to piggyback and build upon what we talked about in episode 3. We discussed those negative consequences of dieting, specifically that hyperphagic period that one can experience after dieting, and it's believed to be a response in order to restore lean muscle mass lost while dieting. We also started to discuss some of the negative impacts that dieting can have on muscle protein synthesis, on overall net muscle protein balance, and on lean mass itself, both at the cellular and the systemic level. So today we're really going to explore different dieting methods and how they relate to lean muscle mass loss while dieting, and then potentially start to touch on some strategies that we can do in order to mitigate lean mass lost while dieting. But before we really get into the science, I don't think today's going to be a super long episode. So as always, I'll give you guys a little update on the research that the Physique Enhancement Lab is doing under Dr. Campbell. So we officially submitted our reverse dieting survey study to the IRB. We sent it out to our pilot population in order to get some feedback. So today we have a meeting later and we will be discussing the feedback that we received. We also started looking into the background and just current scope of literature for the intervention study that we'll be doing after the survey study results come back. So we're just exploring how exactly we want to diet subjects to eventually assign them randomly to one of the different reverse dieting protocols, whether that be straight back to maintenance, reverse dieting as it was operationally defined by the survey, et cetera, et cetera. So we're still kind of hashing out exactly how we want the intervention to look, but that's where we are. And we're really starting to gather just what is the current research out there on best ways to diet somebody in order to preserve muscle mass, because that's something that I think is valuable to everybody, and it will be especially valuable to the subjects in our study. We definitely don't want to put them through a really aggressive diet and have them lose a bunch of muscle mass, and then we also compromise our ability to get good data during the post-diet period if we make them vulnerable to hyperphagia by significantly decreasing their lean mass. So as much as this is kind of a standalone topic, I think what we'll be discussing today in terms of rapid fat loss strategies are going to directly play a role in the research that we're doing in the lab, because a little just recap, in this reverse dieting intervention that we want to do, we want to first put all the subjects through a diet in order to elicit some fat loss. And then from there, when everyone's standardized on a specific deficit or a specific amount of fat loss, we haven't decided that exactly, then we bring them through a post-diet strategy, whether that be, again, ad libitum, straight back to maintenance, an exponential increase, or a gradual increase. Since there's no current research actually defining or explaining or scientifically operationally defining what a reverse diet is, our first part of the study is a survey study that's going to help us operationally define what a reverse diet needs to look like in terms of quantitatively looking at what those increases should look like week to week. So once we have that, then we can utilize that in our post-diet intervention. But before we get to the post-diet, we have to diet down all our subjects. And we don't want the study to be a year long. We don't want them to do a 12-week cut and then undergo like a 12-week reverse. We kind of want to get pretty aggressive with the fat loss. So the strategies that we'll be discussing today, the different studies we'll be looking at today, are all going to be rapid fat loss studies. And they range anywhere from 21 days to 4 days of rapid fat loss. And we can really look at their efficacy as well as their side effects profile as we look at how these different deficits were run. So that's kind of a little update and segue into the topic for the day. And in terms of personal updates, I think last we spoke, I joined the 200 Carb Club. I'm up to 220. We are pushing the growth. It's getting a little uncomfortable, but I'm so freaking excited. I had a nightmare the other day. I think last night or the night before last. I had a nightmare that I stepped on stage and I got 3rd out of 3rd again. And next time I step on stage, I think it will be my 16th or 17th bodybuilding show. And I promise you, I'm not stepping on a stage again until it's undeniable that I will win my class and overall and a pro card. So getting 3rd out of 3rd was like almost, as much as it was a nightmare, it was a huge reminder of like, okay, get over your bullshit and get over your pussy shit and just fucking grow. So I'm welcoming all the food. I'm welcoming all the growth, even if it comes with a little bit of adipose. I'm welcoming it all because I'm not jumping into a diet. We talked about last week how that can just be detrimental to building muscle, to keeping muscle mass. So I'm not jumping into a fucking diet, okay? I promise you. This is my vow to you guys, to myself, and my nightmares are also keeping me in check. So other than that, I think that's pretty much what's happening on my personal side of things. So let's get into the science. So if we recall from last time, we looked at cellular and systemic evidence that suggests that even modest, short deficits will increase your muscle protein breakdown and decrease your muscle protein synthesis. And systemically, we have this anabolic resistance via this dysregulation of the GH-IGF-1 axis that basically makes you less anabolic even in response to anabolic stimuli. So resistance training, protein intake, etc. So dieting is going to significantly attenuate your anabolic capabilities and really work against you when you are trying to build muscle. And when we're in this deficit, if we do lose lean mass, when we're coming out of the deficit, we have this hyperphagic drive in order to theoretically restore the lean mass loss. And that's called the protein stat theory. And it's just basically going to mean that your body will gladly put on a significant amount and even an extra amount of adipose than you started with in order to restore your lean mass. So when we're dieting, we're thinking, what are the strategies that we can take? What can we do in order to mitigate and minimize the amount of muscle mass lost while dieting? So one of those things is obviously consuming high protein. So bare minimum, you should be consuming 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight when you're dieting. And you should never decrease protein. As your calories decrease throughout your diet and your deficit needs to kind of be a little bit more progressive, you can pull calories by pulling down your carbs, you can pull calories by pulling down your fats, you can pull calories by increasing your cardio, but you really should never decrease your protein. That's going to serve as a removal of an anabolic stimulus and only promote that further loss of lean mass. Another thing is that you should never pull back on your resistance training. You should never take it out. Resistance training is an anabolic stimulus that's going to ensure that you don't lose as much mass as you probably would be if you weren't resistance training. So far we have that we need to consume high protein and we need a resistance train. And another very key component is the rate and the duration of your fat loss phase in terms of how aggressive are you getting. So there was this study done by Garth et al. It was published in 2011 from the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences in Oslo in Norway. And they basically looked at two different rates of fat loss. They had both males and females. They were athletes. They were resistance trained, ranging between 17 and 27% body fat. And there was a slow fat loss plan that had them on a 20% deficit and a rapid fat loss plan that had them on a 31% deficit. And the goal was to lose 4% of their body weight. So as you can appreciate, the slow fat loss plan, since they were on a smaller deficit, it probably took them longer to reach that goal. Their protein intake was at the 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, and they were resistance training. So in terms of the slow fat loss group, it took them 8.5 weeks to lose that 4% of their body weight. They lost 9 total pounds. 11 of those pounds came from fat, and I know that's more than 9 pounds. They lost 6% of their body fat, and they gained 2 pounds of lean mass. So 0% of their body weight loss came from lean mass. In fact, they gained 2 pounds of lean mass, and this was with a 20% deficit, slow and steady. It took them 8.5 weeks. And they also saw slightly more improvements in their performance, but it was really only statistically significant in the 1 rep max for their bench press. So we're looking at the slow and steady fat loss approach, 20% deficit. And honestly, in terms of mitigating all those negative consequences that come from that lean mass lost while dieting, this seems pretty fucking good if you ask me. So compared to the fast fat loss group, they were on a 31% deficit and it took them 5.5 weeks to lose the 4% body weight. So significantly less time. They did lose 8 pounds. They lost 7 pounds of fat and 1 pound of lean mass, and a total of a 3% body fat percentage reduction. So 12.5% of the body weight they lost came from lean mass stores. And it's not a huge amount, 1 pound of lean mass. I don't think it's enough to create a really significant hyperphagic detrimental post-diet response. But compared to gaining 2 pounds of lean mass, if I had to bet money on which of the slow versus fast groups had a way more favorable and long-term successful post-diet phase, I would bet money that it was the slow group that didn't lose any lean mass. So the takeaways from this is that if we have a greater deficit, we're more aggressive with it, and it's a more rapid fat loss approach, we're compromising our lean mass more. And there's more lean mass lost compared to a slower rate of weight loss. And another takeaway is that it doesn't seem to impair performance a whole lot. But again, we're only really talking about 5 weeks. So I don't know if that's long enough to fully impair performance. You know, when we're talking about a lot of the deficits that you guys or I might be contextualizing these results to, we're talking like 20, 30 week preps. So that's where performance could probably start to take a bigger hit. But we don't have the data to support that because these studies are pretty short term. So this study really starts to paint this picture that, okay, the more aggressive we get, the more we expose ourselves to those negative risks that come from losing lean mass while dieting. And so we're thinking about what are the best strategies to have a successful dieting phase where we mitigate lean mass lost. We're talking high protein, we're talking resistance training, and we're talking slow and fucking steady wins the fucking race, you guys. So let's look at, can we diet rapidly, successfully, while mitigating those negative consequences? So we're going to look at a 21-day, a 15-day, a 10-day, and a 4-day rapid fat loss study. So I'm going to kind of go through them pretty quickly because they start to paint a similar picture. But in the 21-day rapid fat loss study, so this study was 3 weeks of caloric restriction and looking how it altered protein metabolism. It was done by Dr. Friedlander from Stanford, but this was published by the Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Center and Research and Medical Services at the Veterans Affairs in Palo Alto. So a little bit of a cross affiliation there, but this study basically had 9 subjects. They were 23 years old, all males, all exercising, active, around 16% body fat, and they underwent a 40% deficit for 21 days. So if you recall the previous study we talked about, the slow group did a 20% deficit. The fast group that did see some lean mass lost was a 31% deficit. And now we're talking a 40% deficit, so significantly more aggressive. Their protein was at 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is already lower than that recommended threshold. And they were not resistance training. So right off the bat, I don't think things are looking too good in terms of mitigating the amount of muscle mass lost. But after 21 days on this 40% deficit, these subjects lost 8.5 pounds of body weight, 4 of which came from fat, and 4.5 of which came from lean mass. So 53% of the body weight they lost came from lean mass. They didn't see any change in performance, but again, it's only 21 days. I don't know if that's long enough to affect performance. But all in all, with more weight being lost from lean mass than from fat, I would not say that doing a 40% deficit for 21 days with suboptimal protein intake and no resistance training is at all a favorable approach, even if you're short on time and you got goals to get like suddenly snatched or some shit. Anyways, moving forward to the 15-day rapid fat loss study. This was done by Dr. Mettler from the School of Sports and Exercise Science at the University of Birmingham, and they looked at increasing protein intake during this rapid fat loss. So they had resistance-trained males. They were around 25 years old. They underwent, again, a 40% deficit for 14 days, so a little shorter. And they had half of the subjects in a low protein group, which was 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. And then half of them were in a high protein group, and it was 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. So already that high protein group is definitely above that threshold we talked about. And they were all resistance training. So even though this is still a really aggressive deficit at 40%, and it's still, a 15-day rapid fat loss study, the high protein group is at least above that protein intake threshold that we recommend, and they were resistance training, so they have some anabolic stimulus. So let's see what happened. The low protein group lost 6.5 pounds of body weight, 3 of which were from fat, and 3.5 were from their lean mass stores. So 54% of the weight that low protein group lost came from their muscle mass. The high protein group only lost 3.5 pounds of body weight, but 3 of those pounds came from fat. And they only lost 0.5 pounds of lean mass. So only 14% of the weight loss they saw came from muscle mass. And there was no difference in performance. So this is really further just highlighting the importance of resistance training, because the previous study did not resistance train and they lost a fuck ton of lean mass. And on having adequate protein, the 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight group saw a significant decrease in the amount of lean mass loss compared to the group that only had 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. So this really suggests that this high protein intake attenuates the loss of lean mass during rapid fat loss. So it's not saying that we can't do these aggressive deficits at 40% for short periods of time. It just means you have to really focus on those considerations that are going to attenuate the lean mass lost, such as resistance training, such as adequate protein intake. The next study was a 10-day rapid fat loss study from a group of researchers at Aarhus University from Denmark, led by Dr. Oxfeld. And this was a 10-day study. They had resistance-trained females with regular cycles. They were around 25 years old, around 24% body fat. And they had 2 5-day resistance training protocols that were 4 days on, 1 off, and they switched from upper, lower. So it would be like upper body, lower body, lower body, rest, and then continue. And it was only 10 days total. And they did cardio on days 1 and 3 of the 5-day cycle. They were in a 45% deficit. They had a low-calorie group that was in that 45% deficit. And then they had an optimal calorie group that was eating around 50 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. They were all consuming the same amount of protein, though. So 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. Again, that's the recommended minimum for attenuating lean mass loss. And they were all resistance training. So the 45% deficit group saw a reduction of 3.8 pounds of body weight, 2.9 pounds of which were from fat, and only 0.9 pounds came from lean mass. So that's 24% of the weight they lost coming from lean mass. And it's not ideal, it's not great, but for a 45% deficit, the fact that they were resistance training and the fact that they were consuming adequate protein, I think really helped attenuate some of that lean mass loss, because it's really not that much. They lost less than a pound of muscle mass, but again, still not ideal. When compared to the control that had the quote unquote optimal calories, which is more or less maintenance, they only lost 0.2 pounds of body weight, but 1.1 of those pounds were from fat mass. So they lost around a pound of fat and they gained around a pound of muscle. So they didn't really change in body weight at all, but their body composition drastically changed. And again, they were resistance training. They were consuming adequate protein, and they were at an optimal caloric intake. They were not in a deficit, but they still saw fat loss and they saw muscle mass gain. These researchers took it a little bit of a step further and they looked at myofibrillar protein synthesis rates. And in the low calorie group at the 45% deficit, those rates were decreased. And in the optimal group, those rates were increased. So this is definitely starting to paint this picture of protein being very important in attenuating lean mass loss, but that the 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight might not be a high enough threshold for a recommendation, because in this group, we saw a pound of lean mass lost in 10 days. And in the previous study where they were consuming 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein, they significantly attenuated that lean mass loss. So maybe, as we're looking and refining our recommendations through emerging evidence, because science needs to be a constant, revision, edit, consider the literature, come back, revise again, consider the literature again, because it's ever evolving. The body of literature is ever growing. So as we're looking at these studies, we can in real time start to revise our current recommendations. And this study, at least, and I don't know, you can argue that one study is not enough to completely revise a recommendation, but it's at least pointing in the direction that 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight might not be a high enough minimal protein intake in order to fully attenuate lean mass loss while dieting. And I don't know if we can ever fully attenuate lean mass loss while dieting, but at the very least, maximize the amount that you can attenuate it. In the last study that we're going to look at, which is absolutely fucking nuts, you guys, it was a 4-day rapid fat loss study. 4 fucking days. You guys, this shit is literally whack. They had 4 days of a very, very, very low calorie diet, and they were exercising 9 hours per day. And they wanted to look at the effects of this on body composition. Half of the participants consumed all their very, very low calories from whey protein. The other half of the participants consumed their calories from a carbohydrate supplement. And they wanted to see, would there be a difference between the whey protein or the carbohydrate group in preserving lean mass, in body comp results, and all of that. And the other really cool thing that this study did was that they followed the participants for 1 year after the intervention to see where they were. If you recall last episode, we know that after a diet, when you're given free reins, there's a lot of hyperphagia. A lot of people fat overshoot. They gain back the weight that they lost and more. They end up with more adipose, especially when you get really aggressive. So I think it was really valuable that the study followed the participants for over a year. And just by the way, this was done by Dr. Calvet at the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands in Spain. So let's get into it. It was wild. They had 15 males. They were all overweight or obese, around 40 years old, average BMI of 30. And they had 5 phases. They had pre-testing. They had 4 days of extreme dieting, 3 days of a controlled intake at maintenance, 4 weeks of ad libitum eating plus free exercise, meaning 4 weeks of doing whatever they want. Then they come back and get tested. And then final checkups come in a year later. So for the diet, you guys, these motherfuckers were eating 320 calories a day. 320 calories a day. What in the fuck? It was only 4 days, but holy shit, okay? So 320 calories a day for 4 days. This was an 85% deficit, in case anybody's curious. And half the group ate all of those 320 calories from protein, and the other half ate all of those 320 calories from carbs. This was double blind. They were just given something to eat, and they were told to eat a third of those calories before exercise, a third in the afternoon, and a third in the evening. For exercise, they were doing 45 minutes of one-arm cranking, followed by 8 hours of walking at 2.8 miles per hour. That's 22 miles a day. That's 9 fucking hours of exercise on 320 calories. Yeah, no, it's a no from me, dog. Like, anyways, maybe it won't be a no from you when you look at these results, honestly. So then after the diet, exercise was kind of cut out, and they were brought back to maintenance for 3 days. And then there's that 4-week ad libitum period, and then the 1-year follow-up. So there was no difference between the protein and the carbohydrate group for any of the body composition variables. So we're going to discuss them all as a whole, since all the results kind of were the same across the two boards. And I think that the fact that they were the same is because I think once you get low calorie enough, there's not a huge difference in where your calories are coming from. 320 calories, whether they come from fat, protein, or carbs, your body's really going to just have them probably undergo gluconeogenesis in any way, shape, or form to derive energy from them, is my guess. So in terms of body weight, in 4 days, the subjects lost 11 pounds. They gained 3 pounds after the 3 days at controlled maintenance, but that still puts them at a net loss of 8 pounds of body weight. And then after 4 weeks ad libitum, they were actually down 9.5 pounds from the start. So even though they gained a little bit after those initial 4 days, they ended up losing another 1.5 pounds during 4 weeks of unrestricted eating and exercising. They could do what they wanted. They just had to come back for testing. And then after a year, they were still at a net loss of 5 pounds. So they were given no guidance for what to do throughout that year. They were given no guidance as to what to do during that 4-week ad libitum period. Really, all they did was put in 4 days of really fucking extreme deficit, really fucking extreme exercise, 3 days at maintenance, and then pop off kings. And then they came back and they were still lighter than they began. I think that's a fucking win. So that's just body weight, though. Let's look at the actual body composition details. So in terms of fat loss, they lost 5 pounds of fat after the 4-day extreme wackadoodle deficit. And then they actually lost 6 pounds of fat after the 3-day control. So an additional 1 pound of fat lost. After the 4-week ad libitum period, they were down to 8 pounds of fat loss from the beginning. So an additional 2 more pounds. And then after a full year, they were at a net 4 pounds of fat lost, which again, I think that's a fucking slay. They literally put in 7 days of this extreme work. Well, 4 days of extreme work, 3 days of controlled maintenance, pop off kings for a year. They come back and they're 4 pounds leaner. Like shit, maybe I would sign up for this. And then of course, looking at the lean mass lost, they lost 6 pounds of lean mass in the first 4 days, and those after those extreme 4 days of dieting and exercising. But I'm going to put a little asterisk there, and we'll talk about that in a second. When they were brought back to maintenance for 3 days, they were only at a 2.2 pound net loss. Then they were at a 1.1 pound of net loss after the 4 weeks ad libitum. And after a year, they were at less than a pound of lean mass lost. So all in all, after a year, they only lost less than a pound of lean mass. And one thing that this study did that the previous studies that we discussed, the 21-day, the 15-day, and the 10-day, did not do is that they measured body water. And an important consideration is that whenever you're using body composition assessments, you have fat mass and you have fat-free mass. And the lean mass is usually, used interchangeably with fat-free mass. And in that equation, that calculation of whatever measurement tool you're using, usually it also incorporates body water, because I think it's 70% of your body water is in your fat-free mass. So if you're losing water, you're going to see a greater percentage of loss from your lean mass than you are from your fat mass. And so we'll come back to that in how it pertains to the previous studies in a second. But since this study did look at amount of water lost, there was 7 pounds of water lost in those first 4 days. So when I said that the subjects lost 6 pounds of lean mass in 4 days, they also lost 7 pounds of water specifically in those first 4 days. So I don't really think that they lost all that much lean mass. I think that they just shed a fuck ton of water, eventually recovered some of that water. And at the end of a year where water is kind of equilibrated, they're less than a pound of muscle mass under from where they started. It really honestly looks like the body water was recovered after those 3 days of controlled maintenance. And I assume it was just from sweating from doing 9 fucking hours of exercise a day. But I mean, I guess we will never really know. So the biggest consideration is that water was not reported in the 21, 15, and 10-day rapid fat loss studies. So we kind of have to reconsider that not as much contractile tissue was probably lost as was reported. And that doesn't mean that we need to completely disregard the takeaways that we took from those studies, just maybe taking the actual lean mass lost reported to a lesser magnitude. But we can still look at the differences in lean mass lost relative to each other and make conclusions off that. And those conclusions will still lead us in the direction that we should be resistance training when dieting, we should take it slow and fucking steady, and that we should probably be consuming more than 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. So now that we know how 21, 15, 10, and 4 days of rapid fat loss can look and what they can do, the consequences, if we can use any of this to inform our own dieting modalities, we're going to look at a study that was actually done by Dr. Campbell's lab at USF, our physique enhancement lab. I was not involved in the study. This was already published before I got to the university, but it is a study that we discussed, and it is a rapid fat loss study. It was a 2-week rapid fat loss study. They had males and females between 18 and 49 years old. They were all resistance trained, and they had a 2-week pre-diet phase where they were told to just continue your normal resistance training, continue your normal cardio. They recorded everything they consumed, and they basically established their maintenance intake. Then they underwent a 2-week diet, and there were 2 different groups. One of them was on a 37.5% deficit, and the other one was on a 50% deficit for the first week and a 25% deficit for the second week, but it averaged out to 37.5% deficit. So both of them had the same average deficit. Their protein was at 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, so higher than that bare minimum threshold for preserving lean mass. And the remaining calories after protein was established were 60% carb and 40% fat. During the dieting, they were also told to maintain their previous resistance training and cardio protocols. After the 2 weeks at this average 37.5% deficit, they had a 2-week post-diet period where they were told to consume ad libitum, no instructions, they could do whatever they wanted. All they had to do was document what they did. They also had no exercise requirements. They could keep up their training or they could completely stop it. Truly, free reigns, pop off, kings and queens. So what they found was that during the dieting phase, the subjects did indeed average a 37.6% deficit. And during the ad libitum phase, they actually averaged a 13% deficit. So significantly less extreme, but given free reins, the subjects still chose to be at a net deficit. When it came to their body composition results, they utilized A-mode ultrasound to look at body composition, and there was a 1.5 kilogram of body weight loss. After the diet, it was 1.2% of body fat loss, and after the ad libitum 2-week period, they actually lost 1.3% of their body fat. So they lost even more body fat after 2 weeks ad libitum. They did not experience this hyperphagic event that caused a fat overshoot. They actually were very successful during their free reigns pop-off period, as I like to call it clearly, because I've called it that 7 times during this episode already. So when it comes to fat mass, that was basically a kilogram of fat mass lost, and it was basically maintained. And when it came to their fat-free mass, their muscle mass, this is super interesting. They lost 0.5 kilo muscle mass during the 2-week diet. But after the 2-week ad libitum period, they actually gained 0.2 kilograms from the start. So they ended up in a net gain of lean mass. And when we look at the water loss, because Dr. Campbell covers his fucking bases and he did look at the amount of water loss, 0.4 kilograms of water was lost after dieting, and there was no change after the ad libitum period from the starting baseline. Meaning, when we look at that half a kilo of lean mass that seemed to be lost during the diet, if 0.4 kilos of water was lost, then almost all the lean mass that was seemingly lost during those 2 weeks of dieting was pretty much water. So when we look at the dry fat-free mass, we really only lost 0.1 kilos after 2 weeks of dieting. And after the 2 weeks ad libitum, it was a gain of 0.2 kilos of dry fat-free mass. So all of this is to say that I think Dr. Campbell was able to take all the strategies that were beneficial and all the strategies that were detrimental from the previous rapid fat loss studies and really pick and choose what is necessary in order to prevent or attenuate the muscle mass that we are susceptible to losing during a dieting phase. And I think he did just that. And remember, their protein intake was at 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And they were told to maintain the resistance training. And yes, it was aggressive, but it was not longer than 2 weeks. And it seemed like, they literally continued to lose more fat and gain more muscle during a 2-week ad libitum phase post-diet. So all these considerations taken together, it's starting to paint a less scary picture when it comes to dieting and preserving our muscle mass. Because I think last episode, I basically made it seem like you're fucked. Like if you diet, say goodbye to your tissue, your muscle protein synthesis is going to downregulate. Muscle protein breakdown will be through the roof. Like you're going to waste away. Like, yes, the science can make it sound like that. But when we look at actual weight loss studies that are aggressive, but do take the right considerations in order to preserve muscle mass, we paint a less alarming picture. And I don't want you to take this as like, okay, so then I can diet and gain muscle, because we cannot ignore the cellular data where our net muscle protein balance is at a net loss, even in a 3-day deficit. Even moderate, short, acute deficits will significantly downregulate our anabolic processes and significantly upregulate our anabolic resistance. But when we're looking at systemic body composition results, we know that if we're consuming enough protein and we're resistance training, then we can make even aggressive deficits not as detrimental. But best case scenario is you just don't undergo an aggressive deficit in the first place. You take it slow and steady, like that very first study that compared the 2 different rates of fat loss, and the slow 20% deficit fat loss group actually gained 2 pounds of mass and lost 11 pounds of fat in 8.5 weeks. So taking all this together, you can undergo rapid fat loss successfully. It's a riskier game, in my opinion. And if you do want to undergo just a general deficit and preserve your muscle mass, then protein, resistance training, and conservative deficit would be my main 3 considerations for you. And if you're working with clients, make sure that you are doing everything and having the necessary conversations with them in order to prioritize above all the preservation of muscle mass while dieting. I think the last thing that I would say as a consideration is if you ever have access to get your RMR tested. So I know we talked about, I think in the first episode, how your total energy expenditure is comprised of different things. One of those being your resting metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy you need to just survive, to breathe, to digest, to be just a bare minimum human being. So if you have access to measure your RMR, it can be a great proxy for what's happening to your lean tissue while dieting. From all of Dr. Campbell's experience with fat loss studies, he's an extremely prolific researcher in this specific field in terms of how much research he has in fat loss to preserve muscle mass. I don't think anybody really tops him. In his experience, he's noticed that if there's a muscle lost while dieting, that's going to be reflected in the RMR, and there's going to be an RMR decrease. But if muscle mass is maintained while dieting, the RMR is typically preserved throughout the entirety of the deficit duration. So I guess that's a nice little proxy for you to keep tabs on yourself if you do have access to get your RMR tested. But I just feel like body composition assessments are probably just a more ubiquitous, easier thing to keep an eye on, because I feel like DEXAs and InBodies are just way more readily available than an RMR assessment. So I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to discuss today, just those studies on rapid fat loss that really contextualize what we talked about last week in these different approaches. And they give you the tools that you need in order to see firsthand what happens when we don't have adequate protein, like we saw in that 21-day study where, they were at 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight and they lost more lean muscle than they did body fat. And they were not resistance training. So we see what really happens when we don't cover our necessary bases. But we also see by Dr. Campbell's 2-week study that if you cover your bases, you go above and beyond the 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight recommendation, you keep them resistance training, you can still get aggressive and mitigate those negative effects. So altogether, I don't want to idolize the idea of dieting in the face of gaining muscle because I still think it's completely detrimental to gaining muscle. But we have at least the tools that we need in order to be able to undergo a successful dieting phase, a successful deficit, if your primary goal is fat loss, to where you will not be significantly compromising your mental health coming out of it by falling into huge hyperphagic events. You won't be compromising your hard-earned muscle. You won't be compromising a huge, dysregulation in your body composition or feeding behavior coming out of the diet, even if you choose to go ad libitum. I think in the context of bodybuilding, we get into such extreme deficits that at that point, you can only really do everything you can to preserve muscle mass, and you're not going to prevent the loss of muscle mass in a prep. I think that it's pretty standard to expect at least some, and I'm assuming that the degree to which we lose muscle mass drives a lot of the hyperphagic and quote unquote binging episodes that a lot of people experience post show. And, if you're a coach and you coach people through preps, I don't know if you're not currently implementing these strategies, but this should be your first consideration as you're putting your clients through a prep, putting yourself through a deficit, especially as you get very, very extreme. And if you have the capability to keep a close eye on your lean mass, on your RMR, on different proxies for the success of your lean mass preservation in your deficit. But yeah, I think that wraps up the episode. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. My email is thevaliditypodcast@gmail.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions, cover any specific studies that you guys want me to cover on the podcast. If you have any evidence or contradictions, please send them my way. I love being wrong because it just means that I learned more. And I'm happy to be wrong in the name of bettering the current understanding of the current scientific literature in our space. If you want to follow along my personal stuff, it's at VallFitt across Instagram and YouTube, and to a lesser extent, TikTok. And if you are interested in working one-on-one with me as a client, I am currently taking one-on-one clients, and the application will be in the description. Everything that you hear and you learn, obviously, I implement with my own clients. And I think that not only do I implement it, I try to take the time to teach it to them through check-ins because I do video responses. So if you do kind of want one step further of not just learning, but also implementing, I would love to chat. And last thing is that my training programs are also linked down below, as they also kind of take into consideration all the current scientific literature as to what would be most beneficial for training. So I'm going to stop sounding like a walking, talking ad. I'm going to shut up and let you guys move on with your day. But let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to hearing your feedback, and I will see you in the next episode.